Afternoon, and he's going to be the one basically making the piece for you guys today. I know we were discussing a little bit before we got started here about what we were going to be making, and Colin's going to be making a really nice fluted bowl today. So that's going to be really fun to see. So before we get going here, I'll just kind of briefly explain our studio space for those of you tuning in who may not be as familiar with our setup here at the Glass Pavilion. But every studio is going to have the same basic set of equipment that you need in order to run a glass studio. And obviously the main piece of equipment is our furnace over here. And this furnace is a big melting furnace. It's lined with a lot of refractory that hold a lot of heat. It's an extremely well insulated piece of material, but this is operating at 2,150 degrees Fahrenheit. And at that temperature, glass is able to melt down into a honey-like consistency. And this piece of equipment stays on 24/7, 365. We never shut this off because it's much more efficient to leave it on because it is so well insulated. And we want to be able to get that glass out of there anytime we want. Our next piece of equipment here is our pipe warmer. We can see Colin in his hand here has a preheated stainless steel blow pipe. And we need that glass to be, or that pipe to be nice and hot so the glass will adhere to it. So our pipe warmer here kind of sets that up a little bit, and then we can just give it a quick boost of heat in our last piece of equipment. And these are our two reheating chambers over here. And Colin's going to be using either of those, or that one right there to our immediate right, to begin to reheat the glass throughout the process. So Colin has went ahead and taken our first gather here. And I know that he's going to be doing a double dip today. So that's going to equate to about a gather and a half of glass. So this main first gather, so he's going to kind of hang out for a minute. He cooled the pipe. He's swinging it in the air, allowing it to kind of take this nice even shape. And he's just letting this cool down a bit or get a bit of a skin on the surface. So that way, when we go to gather, we can get a little bit more out of the tank. So he's looking for movement and he's looking for color to make sure that it's stable enough to withstand the heat of the furnace so it can gather out enough material on this next dip. Yeah. So looks like he's ready here. And after this gather of glass here, this is when we're going to add on the different layers of color. And we have a really nice mix of some pink glass out that I can show here in just a moment. So we can see this new layer has encased the prior, and this is all clear and colorless glass. One other thing I forgot to mention when explaining the furnace is at this temperature, the glass is hot enough to emit its own light, but this is all clear and colorless glass. So we're going to move on over here. And on this marvering table, this smaller mini portable one that we have a tray of color laid out. And we can get the camera up to this. So what's happening is this color here is small enough to where it can be preheated instantly by that molten material and allow it to adhere to the surface. So we have all these little chips of color. And Colin just has to go and melt that in for just a brief moment. Because those chips are so small, they want to melt relatively quickly. Now, if we were using other types of color, say like bar stock, which I have an example of here, this is just a rod, here we are, a rod of glass color. And we would lop off maybe about an inch or two, about like this, and we would need to preheat this to about 950 degrees or so in order for that glass to actually adhere. Our glass is what we call a soft glass. It's a soda-lined glass. And it is very susceptible to thermal shock. So if it's at room temperature, it cannot be heated up too quickly, or otherwise it will crack. And the same goes for when it's molten. It cannot cool down too rapidly, or it will crack. It has to be slowly eased into heating or cooling, depending on the state that it's in. So Colin's going to do maybe 2 or 3 layers of this pink glass mix. Is this your third layer here? Cool. So this is going to be his final layer. And we have to do a couple layers of this frit because it's going to give more of a specklized appearance. If we want a full colorization, we would use rod or that bar stock that I just showed, or we could use powderized glass, something a little bit more fine that's going to give a nice even coating of color. But a lot of people choose frit for that aesthetic purpose of having those bits of speckled glass. So we have all of our color laid on, and now Colin's just primarily melting all of that in, and then he's going to make sure everything is nice and even. We don't want any inconsistencies in this glass. We want it to be nice and smooth and homogeneous before we go and take our final gather out of the furnace. Oh, and it looks like he's opting to twist this color up. So there's a really cool mechanic happening. So this steel table is a heat sink. It's pulling the heat out of the glass. We can use it to shape, and we can see he's turning in one direction. And it may be hard for the camera to pick up the fine details, but as Colin turns in one direction, that friction that's created creates torque on the glass, and it allows that color to streak out and kind of stretch and spin. It's just a nice way that we can change the effect of that color type. So he may do that again, but I think he may be happy with that. So now he's going to most likely just get the glass into a nice shape. He could do that using either our marvering table, or he could expedite the process a little bit using our blocking tool at the bench. But he's going to get this shaped up to be able to inflate our initial bubble into the glass that we're going to use to inflate the shape completely later. So going for our blocking tool. This blocking tool is just a couple bits here. We have a carved wooden spoon here, and then we have a carbon fiber handle. Normally it would be a wooden handle, but we've opted to switch to carbon fiber here at the Glass Pavilion. But we use a lot of different kinds of fruit woods, primarily cherry, because it has a tight grain pattern, a low sap content. It's very, very absorbent to water, and it doesn't ash as much as some other woods. So it's just the perfect, something superheated comes into contact with moisture, it's going to instantly vaporize it and create a layer of steam. And that's what's going to give us this nice shape here. So we can see that Colin has blown some air into his pipe, and he's capping the end with his thumb. And as his moisture of his breath travels forward, it's also evaporating. And it's going to be a little bit more difficult to see the expansion because we have color on the end of this pipe here, so that kind of gets in the way of seeing through. But we can see some very minor expansion happening here. It's very subtle, but we maybe have a golf ball sized hole and inside this glass now. So we can tell that it's expanded by this spot right here. It's got a bit of a shoulder to it. So now that we have our bubble inside and we have all of our colors set up, that's normally the longest part of the process. There's a million different ways to blow glass and a million different techniques that can be done a million different ways. That's kind of the amazing part of glass blowing. But normally, setting up your color, getting everything ready here on our initial couple gathers of glass is going to take the longest. The blowing pretty much only takes up maybe about 10 to 15% of the process. So making sure that the glass has all of the color that it needs, all the patterning that it needs, we need to make sure that that's nice and perfectly set up. Otherwise, the process is going to be more difficult later on. So now Colin's just waiting. We can see that the initial orange glow of that intense heat from the furnace has now left the glass, and that lets us know that we're reaching a point where we're a little bit more rigid, and that's a good thing because we need to be able to withstand the temperature and the heat of that furnace. That 2,000 degrees is a lot of heat. So because this is a hollow form, if that glass is too hot, it can actually collapse the form and we would lose our shape. So he's gone in, he's stripping a little bit of the glass off. That's why he's spending a little bit more time in that furnace. And now we can see that very immense glow. We've encased all of that prior glass with a new layer of clear molten material. And now that we've done this, we're going to shape up this fresh and molten layer of glass. Would you like an 8 block? Oh, newspaper. All right, so now this is a very, very nice gather. This is the sign of somebody who's very skilled. They come back to their bench after their gather and it looks like it's supposed to. That means his heat was just right, the speed of his turning was just right, but he's just basically putting a skin on the surface of that using this newspaper. Newspaper is one of the newer tools at the hands of the glass blower. but it's a really, really handy tool and probably one of our most versatile because it really just relies on your hand, how you're shaping your hand and how you're cradling the glass. So Colin has put a bit of a skin on that, like I said before, and this initial heat here after taking that gather is to make sure that everything is nice and even in temperature. Otherwise, our bubble could expand unevenly and then it would mess up the distribution of the material. So alongside making this a fluted bowl, Colin has opted to use one of our aluminum molds here. And this is what is, oh yeah, I can show the mold. So we have a 12-point mold here that Colin is going to use and drip the glass into it and inflate it lightly. But right now, he's just making sure that that mass of material can fit inside this mold. So he's squeezing down a bit, elongating it. And this is just going to give a nice additional quality to the glass. Like we said, this is an optic mold, so it's going to look really interesting. It's going to give the glass a really nice ribbed texture, and I believe Colin's going to twist it up as well, so it's going to look really nice in the final product. Here we can get a good view of this. So he's going to put a lot of heat into this glass. We want to but this mold is really nice because it's just like all of our other metal tools here in the studio. It's going to really rapidly pull the heat out of the glass, which is good because we're going to be able to have some stability then to twist this up without the bubble getting too long and too out of control. So here we can see Colin coming out. He goes straight up and down, allows the bubble to stretch a tiny bit, goes inside and pushes, and then he just blows lightly. He doesn't need to blow too hard here. We can see it slowly rising up out of the mold. The bubble's inflated. We hear that tap, and now we can really see that very, very nice optical effect that that mold has given. Excellent. So we could hear how rapidly the heat was being pulled out of the glass. You heard Colin tap it in the mold, and you could hear it. It sounded like glass on metal. And that's because this is a very abrasive tool in pulling the heat out of the glass. But it's going to help us out in the long run because he's going to be twisting this. So by kind of stealing some of that heat on the very outer skin, the core is still hot. And you really need that core heat in order for the glass to do anything. So in order to twist this, Colin's going to make a little pull point with his jacks. So this tool here is a very versatile one as well. The ancient Romans utilized the jacks 2,000 years ago when glassblowing was first invented. And we can use it to constrict down. And we can see we have this little button at the end of the pipe. He's going to quench that in water to freeze it up so that way it doesn't heat up as quickly as the rest of that mass in our reheating chamber. And that's going to be a point that he can use as a handle to pull as he's spinning, and this is going to twist up that optic and make it look really, really nice. Also, the direction of his turning in the reheat chamber plays a role in this. So he's going to be twisting this to the left because he's going to be pulling or pushing the glass away from himself or rolling it away as he's twisting. So I'm actually going to step right here and I'm just going to block his hand. There we go. He got an initial twist going here, but he's going to make one more and do one more twist so we can continue that twist all the way through the form. Excellent. Would you like a door, Colin?
Maybe when I come out.
Okay. So the piece is inflating slightly. As you're twisting, you do need to apply a little bit of air pressure, and Colin has a blow hose that allows him to do that. But the piece is inflated a bit, and it's getting a little too sizable for this first set of doors. It's getting a little close, because if you stick to the door, you pretty much lose your piece. So we're just going to open up these doors here to accommodate for the size of his bubble now. So real quick, just going to block his hand here. Got that nice twist going through it. I think that looks great. And now he's just blowing lightly and using this newspaper here because it is also soaked in water. That water is going to cool down where it's coming into contact with. We're going to be making more of a bowl shape today. So we want to retain as much of that thickness as we can. Yeah. We want to retain as much of that thickness as we can at the base of the bubble, or the tip of the bubble. That's going to be the bottom of our piece. It's not going to be as big of a deal because we are going to be putting a nice foot on this piece today, but it's still good to practice adding in the constriction line. And that constriction line is going to be a weak point in the glass that allows the glass to know where it's going to be removed from the pipe later. It's okay. So we've got that initial line in, and Colin's bubble was a little bit large than we normally have it before we set this line in. But it's no big deal. We can always fix it with fire. That's the nice thing about working with glass. You can just reheat it and get it where it needs to be. So he's elongating a tiny bit and then going back in to constrict down on that. Nice save. Nice. And I was just using this paddle here to block his hand. We can see Colin is wearing a sleeve to protect his forearm. That forearm skin is a little bit softer, so it kind of really feels that radiating heat from the material because you're hovering right above it as you're working. So just kind of blocking his arm so that way it feels a little bit less intense of heat on him. So now we're going to kind of set this form up a bit. We're going for a bowl shape, so we want our bubble to be a little bit lower. So Colin's going to maybe do a little bit more inflating. It's already fairly thin, but he might blow it out to change the profile a tiny bit. And then we'll be done with the process of working on the blowpipe. What's that, Colin? Okay. So he's going to do a little bit more inflating, and he's going to be utilizing this newspaper again to kind of make sure that the bottom isn't going to blow out as quickly as the rest of the form. He's putting the waist of the piece, it's a wide waist, obviously, we're making a bowl, but he's trying to kind of put that towards the middle of this bubble. So that's what's nice about the paper. He can kind of adjust that. He can apply pressure where it needs to in order to move that where it needs to be. So we're getting wider, so we're probably going to need this door on the way out, and this is where Colin's going to squat this bubble up to make that nice lower bowl shape. So it works the same way with trapping air in the pipe. He's just going to cap it, and he has a blow hose on, so he can just use his tongue to cap the end, and he's just going to angle upward and turn in one direction. And that's going to allow the bubble to not fully collapse, but it's going to cause the walls to expand outward. And it's going to squat it up a bit. It's going to make that form a little bit lower. And once again, goes on with the paper, does a little bit more inflation. Excellent. Very nice. Okay, you want me to leave this door open for you? Alrighty. So the bubble has gotten wide enough to where it's exceeded the size of both of our first sets of the doors. So we're going to leave those open so he has the ease of going in and out. Colin's going to allow this to cool down a tiny bit before we add our foot, and that's going to be the last step we'll take before transferring this to another pipe to be completed. So again, the balance in heat is very, very important when we're working with glass. We're going to be adding an addition of molten material. So his bubble needs to be decently steady in order for that to be attached without deforming the shape. So I'm going to grab a pair of diamond shears so I can cut this glass free. And I'm going to do a quick rake of the furnace. Raking the furnace allows us to push any surface bubbles towards the back of the tank. So it's just this flat rod of steel, and we just go in and skim the very top layer to push any bubbles to the back of the tank for when we're gathering. Ready, Colin?
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, so in order to create this foot, we've got a little bit larger of a punty rod. It's just a solid stainless steel rod. Can't blow through it. There's no opening at the end. This is just all solid. But this allows us to gather solid masses of glass out. So I'm going to be taking a double dip for this to have enough material to make a nice clear foot for Colin. So we have our first gather out of the tank, and this is going to be a lot like how we did it at the very beginning of the process. It's just getting a second gather of material before this glass cools down fully. So we're not getting the full amount of 2 gathers, about a gather and a half. So it's looking like it's ready. I'm just going to dip in, take one more gather. Got all this glass out now. So I'm just going to bring this straight over to our marvering table and let this drip. And this is what we call a cookie foot. This is just a nice, solid addition of material that creates a very, very nice foot for the piece to rest on and elevate it off a surface. So Colin lightly taps it at first, and he just spins in one direction looking for center. If we touched it down too hard at first, it could fuse all the way and we could stick it off center. It's very, very easy to do that. So he taps it lightly, so that way, just in case it's off center, he can drag it using that friction of that steel table, like I explained earlier, to make sure that it's centered up. But he stuck that really nicely right off the bat. So now, before we transfer this piece, we're going to shape this clear addition of material up, and he's going to do that using the newspaper. So again, newspaper being a very versatile tool, he can use his thumb and his fingers. He can put his fingers underneath this little lip here and push in with his thumb, making sure that it's coming into contact. There's a lot more surface area touching, and it's shaping that up nicely. So this first shape with the paper is just to make sure that it's pushing down evenly and it's completely sealed. And now we're going to go on with the jacks and the paddle here to really crispen it up and make it look very nice. Finalize the shape. And we're basically just making a mold with our tools here. Excellent. And now we have a nice little foot added onto our piece. And this is the final state that the piece is going to be in on this pipe. So now we're going to go ahead and transfer it. I'm going to give Colin just a second here because that foot is still a little bit warm. We just want to make sure that everything evens out nicely before we transfer. Just let it take a heats just to even everything out. And he's just making sure that that's pushed in enough to where it's sitting on more of a rim as opposed to a flat surface. It just makes it a lot more steady that way. Alrighty, so Colin has just signaled to me that he's ready for the punty. I'm going to bring these back to you. You need these. So we're using another punty rod, except this is a little bit more specialized of a punty. It's what we call a step-down punty, and I'll bring this over and show it real quick. This is a little bit lower. It's stepped down. It's a little bit more narrow at the very tip, and that allows us to not gather as much glass. But the pipe is a little bit wider, makes it a little bit easier to turn. So I'm going to heat the end of this rod just a little bit and take another small gather out of the furnace. And that small gather is going to act just like a little bit of glue. It's going to allow us to stick to the bottom of the piece and support the weight of that bowl. So I've got a small little gather of glass out of the tank here. I'm going to shape this up using our marver. And a punty has a very, very specific shape. There's a lot of different ways to make a punny depending on what you need it for, but this one that I'm making here is fairly universal for most vessel blowing. It's tapered to the pipe, so that way if it does begin to crack early, the cracks are going to start lower, and it's not going to crack higher up to where the connection is actually taking place. It's just a little bit of a safety net for us, because this part of the process is where a lot of beginners fail and break their piece, because it is very difficult. Everything has to be pretty perfect for this to happen smoothly. So here's the shape I was talking about, tapered to the pipe with a dome on the end with a little tip. And now I'm supporting the weight of this pipe, and he's looking to make sure that everything is in line. Feels good. So we've got it nice and lined up. The glass is not too hot, so all it takes is a little bit of cold water. And that shock that's created from the cold water on the hot glass just makes it very weak, so that way that nice little tap with the metal tool allows the piece to break away, and that small bit of glass is going to act like glue. So that was what we call a very, very successful transfer. So I take this brief flash here to make sure everything's nice and evened out again, and then I just bring it right back to Colin. And while he's still got time, while that punny's hot, he can do any final adjustments before it cools down to the point where it's no longer going to be moving. Very, very nice. Right. So now that area that was just broken was cooled down enough to the point where it was able to break nice and cleanly. So we're going to be boosting about maybe 1,000 degrees back into that front portion in order to get the glass workable again. So this is usually one of the longer heats of the process because we don't have that immense heat from the furnace in the glass any longer, but we need to get it to a temperature where we can stretch this open. The nice thing about making a fluted bowl is that the very end step of the process just relies on physics to help us do it and give it that nice organic fluted shape. But we do need to initially open this up a bit to make sure that those flutes are going to look nice. So Colin's just taking a couple short flashes every now and then to keep that punny warm, but we can see that front lip is now glowing nice and hot again. So I'm going to go on with a paddle here, make sure that lip is nice and even. We don't have any inconsistencies where it just broke. And he's using the blades of his jacks. Earlier in the process, we used that tool to constrict down. But the other nice thing about it is we can use the sides of the blades to shape the glass and to open up vessels. So by going in at a horizontal angle, slowly lifting and opening the blades of the jacks, it's just going to stretch that glass out and widen the diameter of the lip. So with a bowl, we normally want to do this very slowly. We don't want to force the bowl to do anything that it doesn't want to do. We need to make sure that the heat is just right and distributed where it needs to be in order to kind of keep that shoulder pushed back and allowing the diameter to open slowly. It can get very difficult to do a non-fluted bowl. It's just a very, very hard thing to do because it's not something that the glass wants to naturally do. You have to really baby it and work it slowly. Once again, just kind of going on nice and lightly with the paddle as he's going, and that's just going to keep it nice and centered, nice and straight. So Colin's maybe going to do this a couple more times because we don't need to open this up into a nice, clean, even lip. We're going to do that flute. So we just want to get it wide enough to where it's not going to open super crazily on us and just kind of go all over the place. We want it to be nice and deliberate, even though the flutes are always going to look different every time. We kind of want to deliberately set that up into the proper shape beforehand.
I might not be able to fit back in once I clear it out.
Probably not. That's okay though. Right before you go, just let me know. I'll put my gloves on. So slowly soaking the heat back up. We can see that now that the lip is getting wider and thinner, it doesn't take much heat to final move here. So just in case we can't fit back in the reheating chamber, I'm going to get my gloves on. And I'm going to open up both of these doors here. I'm going to start with the left door. And then I'm just going to get ready with this door here. And when he gives me the signal, nobody look away, it's going to happen real quick, but when he lets me know that it's ready, I'm going to open this door and he's going to spin faster and faster. That bowl's going to fan open and then we're going to angle downward. We can see that super fast spinning is allowing it to fan out, and now he's just going to angle down and slow down the speed of his turning, and that's going to create those really, really beautiful flutes. Excellent job. And that's what we call a handkerchief bowl. Really, really nice deep ripples. Very, very thin and delicate glass. And it looks like he's just able to fit, which is good for Colin because that allows him to take a final flash on the piece and make sure the heats are nice and even. Alrighty. So now that we've taken the final shape of the piece, Colin just needs to boost some heat back into that punty once again. And that's just to make sure that there's enough stress built up into the glass that it breaks off nice and cleanly at that point of connection. Obviously, we're not going to be able to enjoy our nice bowl if it's connected to a 4-foot-long rod of steel. So we just want it to break off as cleanly as possible. So by boosting a little bit of heat into it, that's all we need to ensure that it's going to break nice and cleanly. So now we're going to walk over to our knockoff table. This table is lined with a highly heat-resistant insulation that's used in refractory called FiberFrax. And once again, it's just a little bit of cold water, and Colin's just applying that with our super high-tech kitchen butter knife. We hear that little sizzle, and that lets us know that we've fissured the glass. And just a nice gentle tap there is going to break that free, but that leaves us with a little sharp spot. So all it takes to get rid of that little sharp spot is our hot torch. This is an oxypropane torch. That oxygen really allows this flame to get up to a very high temperature. It's going to create a little puddle where that sharp spot was, and we have our TMA stamp here to get rid of that little spot and let you know it was made right here in our hot shop. So now I can go ahead and grab the glass. Got one final look at our bowl here, and now we're going to load it away inside of our annealing oven. Nice, dude. Yeah. Awesome. And there we have our final piece. So, digital round of applause for Colin. He did an excellent job on that vessel. So now this piece of machinery is the final step in the process in the hot shop. We could always go into cold processing, which happens after the hot shop, where we can grind the glass with diamond embedded lapidary equipment, tile equipment, and things like that. But before we can get to that, this annealing oven is what's allowing the glass to slowly cool down. So the glass was rigid, it was solid at that moment, but it's still about maybe 1,000 to 900 degrees. And at that temperature, the glass is stable to rest at. It's not too hot in this box at 918 to slump it, and it's not cold enough to induce any thermal shock. So it could rest in here for a couple days or a week, something like that, and it would go relatively unchanged. But we were going to get it out as soon as possible. So at the end of the night, we're going to send this down on a cycle, and our cycle here is maybe about 16 to 18 hours. And that's just also dependent on the thickness of the glass. So Colin's form to get that nice handkerchief shape was very, very thin. It was only a couple millimeters thin. The thickest portion was the foot at maybe about an inch thick. And that's plenty of time to anneal the glass and alleviate the stress in that 16 to 18 hour time frame. But those of you who are familiar with the Glass Pavilion here know about our glass bench in our ancient gallery. That glass was casted into sand, and its thickest point is maybe about 3 feet thick, 2.5, 3 foot. And that piece of glass needed to anneal for upwards out tomorrow, and it's going to look very, very nice. And before we go, We would like to thank Owens, Illinois for their continued sponsorship of our live stream demonstrations here at the Glass Pavilion. Thank you so much. If you guys enjoyed this demonstration, it's going to be posted up onto our YouTube page afterward. So if you liked what you saw, we would definitely appreciate you to share it for other people to get in on the information and enjoy watching one of our demonstrations here. So thank you all again for tuning in. Our live stream demonstrations are going to commence on Wednesday of next week. We'll be doing Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday 2 p.m. demonstrations. So tune in. Thank you so much.